as we now have one full day to digest exactly what happened between the Trump and Putin phone call. More things are coming into clarity here, and more panic is setting in Europe, and more just complete detachment from reality. I know you may be thinking, come on, you already said they were detached from reality, but I think, and you may agree with me after you see this episode here, that it has detached a little bit more. And I think that the reality is starting to set in. I think it's even more so than that. And we'll see the ramifications and potential consequences of that. And to try and help us make sense out of what is unfolding right now, we have the ever popular Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst and former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and of course, highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, listen, this is a lot of curious things, and we're going to be asking you to do a little bit of interpreting as well as just kind of an analyzing what's going on here, because I think there could be some multiple layers of what's actually going on here. But there is definitely some contradictions and confusion among all the parties except Russia. They're not confused or contradicted. They have kind of remained in the same place while things swirl around them, and we'll get into what that's going to mean. But let's start off, first of all, with President Trump yesterday after the meeting. He was in the Oval Office making a presentation, and of course was asked questions about what happened with the call.
Did you ask President Putin to meet with you?
About what?
About Ukraine.
Yeah, of course I did. I talked to him about it. I said, when are we going to end this, Vladimir? I know him for a long time now. I said, when are we going to end this bloodshed, this bloodbath? It's a bloodbath. And I do believe he wants to end it. It's a terrible war. It's a very hard to extradite themselves away from what's taking place over there. I said to him, we got to get going. And I did say also, if I thought that you couldn't do it, I'd step away, because what are you going to do? We don't have boots on the ground. We wouldn't have boots on the ground. But we do have a big stake. And the financial amount that was put up is just crazy.
Okay, about in the middle of that soundbite right there, he said what I think is a really important thing. He said, I told Putin that if we can't come to an agreement, then I'll basically just walk. And so, because what else can you do? So if you tell your opponent in negotiations at the beginning that if this drags out, I'm out, then you have given him every incentive to make sure nothing happens. I mean, how do you see that?
I think there are two things that we should keep in mind that President Trump, I think, actually ignores. Number one, we are a co-belligerent. We are de facto allied with Ukraine. You'll recall several times I've come up and said the first thing we need to do is suspend all aid, military aid to Ukraine, and withdraw all U.S. personnel, civilian, military, intelligence, whatever, from Ukraine. Then we can talk. The problem is we've never done that. So the real question is, if we are mightily responsible for the outbreak of this war, we built up the Ukrainian military with the help of our allies. We equipped it lavishly. There were over 800,000 Ukrainians, both reserve and active duty, ready to fight when the Russians ultimately, reluctantly intervened in eastern Ukraine. They didn't expect to find that kind of a force. They didn't expect to fight for months or years. They thought this would come to an end in April with some sort of compromise. And of course, we all know that that failed for a whole range of reasons. But the bottom line is that I think that President Trump has unrealistic expectations. He doesn't seem to understand that we can't mediate because we're part of it. Now, the second part is that I think President Putin has tried very hard to be polite, and to the extent that he can be flexible, to be flexible. But he's restated his preconditions for any sort of ceasefire from the beginning. And those preconditions require the acceptance of neutrality for Ukraine, the acceptance of the oblasts that the Russians took, that are Russian-speaking oblasts, that they're not going to surrender, an end to any further discussion about Crimea, which is Russian. And then, obviously, some discussion about denazification, which, we should have absolutely no objections to. And what sort of Ukraine emerges from that with elections and so forth and so on. Those things are all areas where there is some flexibility, except for the denazification. President Trump doesn't seem to have understood that. And so he seems to think that if he can't persuade President Putin to adopt his position, which is let's have a ceasefire and talk, then he's just going to pick up his toys and go away. I don't think President Trump understands that his toys are still in the game. And as long as they're in the game, his credibility is almost zero.
It's interesting because you pointed out there that the Russian position, Putin, when he came out, did say in his about 3-minute statement after the meeting, he said, "Yeah, sure, we'll agree to talk about these things. We'll talk about a ceasefire. We're more interested in the end of war negotiations, but we're open to that." And then he added, of course, it has to, address all the root causes, which is their code word for all the things you just mentioned about the territory and all that kind of stuff. So meaning that Putin didn't change anything that he didn't say in the many months prior to that. So it came out. And so Putin seemed relatively happy. Trump came out and said he was pretty happy about how things went out, especially on his Truth Social. But it really seems that the Russian media picked up on all the nuances, and they kind of have a good idea that it worked out really well for their side. Here's how the Russian media viewed it today.
Kommersant believes the call went very well for the Kremlin. It quotes President Putin as saying Russia agreed to work on a memorandum about a possible future peace agreement, defining a number of positions. Possible and future make it all sound rather vague. And that's the whole point. As the paper says, this way, Russia wins extra time and an unspecified time frame, while negotiations take place on agreeing the principles of a memorandum about something that's possible in the future and that defines a number of positions. And Russia will use this time as it sees fit. The paper quotes Putin as saying, "The conversation with Trump was very constructive. I rate it highly." The reporter adds, "Of course he does. The telephone call went his way." He notes that at the start of the call, Vladimir Putin congratulated the 47th US president on the birth of his 11th grandchild and wished Donald Trump's daughter good health. That was very smart. After that, you could say the conversation was destined to succeed. A political pundit tells Izvestia the results of the conversation with Trump, as described by Putin, show that Moscow continues to oppose a comprehensive ceasefire until a compromise can be found on those questions Russia considers key. First and foremost, we're talking about Ukraine making compromises and concessions. I think that last line says it all, really. Russia is ready for compromise and concessions, as long as it's Ukraine doing the compromising and making the concessions.
I mean, that last part there seems completely in line with everything you've been saying since the war began, that Russia is not going to make concessions or compromises because they don't have to. They have the military power, the industrial, diplomatic, everything you want to mention there. And just, again, I have to ask, what don't the U.S. and Europe get?
The Europeans want a Ukraine that is not neutral. What its connection or relationship is with this increasingly irrelevant structure called NATO is open to question. But the notion is they want that somehow or another to be left open. I think the Europeans want to be able to put forces either into Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. Europeans want to have a say in the government that emerges in Kiev. And we could go on and on. None of that is going to happen. All of that is impossible. And the Europeans right now are hanging on by a thread. By the way, I think financially, we're not far behind in that sense. So I think President Putin knows that he can exercise more patience and things are going to go his way. Now, the one thing I thought was very interesting in this thing is that everyone was happy with the call in Russia. I think there are a lot of people in Russia who are very concerned, having fought this war for these many years and lost somewhere between 100 and 130,000 killed, that nothing be given away to the Ukrainians. And that's a very important thought to keep in mind. I mean, if you have a son or a brother or a father or your relative, you're extremely unenthusiastic about any sort of compromise that throws away what your respective relative died fighting for. So I think Excuse me. I think that President Putin understands that very well.
And in fact, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, understands it very well, too. And so they are in no hurry to get anything done here. And I'm going to show you later in this episode why that is. But this is what he's saying today. He said that there are no, after the phone call, he said there's no deadlines and there cannot be any. It's clear that everyone wants to do this as quickly as possible. But of course, the devil's in the details. And I actually watched one of the video excerpts of him saying this statement right here. And he just has this kind of coy little smile on his face. Like he's like, this is just code for it ain't ever going to happen. But sure, we'll talk about it all day long and drag this thing out while we keep going forward on the battlefield. And then at some point, I think what's going to happen. But the Russians are specifically saying, despite whatever Trump's talking about, that I want to get this over with quickly, it's not going to be over with quickly.
No, well, everything that President Trump does is designed to be quick. It's designed to make a flash and signal to everybody that this is another Trump success story, another Trump victory. He's not going to get it out of this by any stretch of the imagination. Now, there was a mention of a memorandum. I don't know what the content of that would look like, but I suspect it might be useful to go back and look at the memorandum that was agreed to in April of 2022 between the Ukrainians and the Russians before Zelensky and his friends assassinated one of the leaders of the negotiating team from Ukraine and decided to throw it out. I suspect there'll be some similarity there. As you said, the Russians have been very consistent in what they want, very consistent in their demands. So none of this is new. Now, President Trump also has a habit of hearing what he wants to hear, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, and I've got something on that here in just a second. But I just showed you what the Russian media said after this. I'm going to show you just a little bit of what the at least American media said to this, and it's going to be Brother Jack Keane. And just hold on to your code here, because in the first part of what he's going to say, he actually says something I think we might agree with. Then he makes this pretty big stumble at the end, which we'll see if you pick it up.
He also knows the president is impatient, so he drags out these negotiations and makes no concessions at any of these negotiations that have taken place, and I don't expect any of it going forward. And then he obviously talking to the president because he wants to avoid sanctions, and his attempt is to convince the president that he's interested in peace as much as the president is. Of course, his actions don't speak to that. And he's also trying to convince the president that what he wants is normalized relations with Russia, which would have significant economic benefit to both countries. That is a true statement. But it's pretty hard to have normalized relations with a criminal who's conducting genocide on a regular basis.
That last phrase there, not quite sure who he was talking about there that fits that definition. I'm not sure it was Vladimir Putin.
No, I suspect he's mixing up his comments. Perhaps they put the wrong page of points in front of him, and he was really talking about Netanyahu. But this is the old mantra. Anybody who opposes us is the enemy and a criminal. Anybody who works with us or for us is, a saint. It's a lot of nonsense. And making those kinds of statements is a huge waste of time. It's just hot air. Otherwise, he did imply what I said, that President Trump wants something to happen quickly, and it's not going to. But that's not because President Putin is deliberately drawing it out. Nothing could be further from the truth. President Putin very definitely wants an end to the war, but he doesn't want to end up having to come back and fight another one. You probably remember in 1991, as when we finished in Desert Storm, a comment that I made to you and others at the time was, it's not over. We stopped too early. We need to finish this thing. If we don't go to Baghdad, not for the purpose of occupation, but to remove the man in power, put somebody else in power, then call in the UN or someone else to supervise elections, we'll end up coming back in 10 years. Well, it turned out to be a little longer than 10. But effectively, I think Putin is in the same boat. He doesn't want to prematurely end this and then end up having to fight another war in the future, because he knows our track record. We won't relent. We'll continue to instigate chaos and foment rebellion wherever we go. And that's certainly going to be the case in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I actually very distinctly remember you saying that on the ground in 1991 while we were still there about when the called off. Because I remember had the big battle of 7-3 East, and we passed, I think it was the 1st and 3rd Infantry and Armored Divisions through us. And you're like, all right, now let's get ready because then we're going to go forward in the next phase one day. And then all of a sudden it gets called off. And I remember you saying that at that time, and turned out to be pretty prescient. Want to look at one other thing here from the U.S. side before we get into the European side, and that is Vice President Vance, who gave his own comment about how he thought Russia was in some need that these discussions could actually help solve.
I think, honestly, that President Putin, he doesn't quite know how to get out of the war. If you think about this, he's got 1 million men under arms. He's re-engineered his entire economy. What used to be manufacturing facilities making, products for people to use in their civilian life, they're now making tank shells and artillery shells and drones. And so this is a little bit of a guess, but I think the president would agree that part of this is I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin has a strategy himself for how to unwind the war, of course, that's been going on for a few years now. And I think there's also just a little bit of, look, there's fundamental mistrust.
Okay, who's to disagree that there's a lot of mistrust, but that Putin has a difficulty unwinding the war? Don't really see a lot of evidence of that.
No, Vice President Vance knows nothing about Russia, knows nothing about the current government that is leading Russia, doesn't understand the mood inside Russia. If anything, the Russian people are just as adamant as President Putin is in establishing the end state that he's outlined. They want an end state that will not pose a threat to Russia. And if that were us and we were if that was the United States and we were on the border with Mexico and we were talking about northern Mexico, we would be in very much the same frame of mind, as we've said before repeatedly. So no, I don't think he understands something else. Whatever burden the war has represented to Russia, its economy, and its people, it has not profoundly affected the standard of living in Russia. In fact, Russia's economy is humming. Its standard of living has been sustained. And the Russian people are the kind of human beings that will endure a certain amount of pain if they're required to do so in order for their country to be victorious. They have a very different society from ours, a different history. So I think he is suffering from a common American malady, and that is to project on someone else the way we would react or respond to things. It's not accurate.
Yeah, and we are definitely seeing a lot of that on the European side. Let's go ahead and take a look at that part here. Let's look at now the Ukraine and the European reactions to all of this. And I think you're going to see very graphically displayed exactly what you're talking about there. First of all, let's go to Brother Zelensky, who remains quite defiant in response to all this. He had a phone call with Trump before the phone call with Putin, had another one afterwards. And after all that, he replies so that it is the duty of our military to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yes, some areas are temporarily occupied due to the aggression of a much larger country, but there will be no ultimatums and no one will surrender our land, our territory, our people, or our homes, Zelensky said. Ergo, he sets himself just almost like a 45-degree angle opposed to anything that either Russia or Trump is talking about here. And if that is the position of the Ukraine side, then if there's even the fantasy hope of narrowing the distance between the two sides to get any kind of an agreement on whether it's a ceasefire or an end of war negotiation, it's moving in the opposite direction.
Well, that's a very heroic statement for someone to make who has led Ukraine into a war that's cost the Ukrainian people 1.5 million dead. And that's the current estimate. How many others are wounded is anybody's guess. He's destroyed the country. He's driven large portions of its population out because the readiness to die has ebbed considerably. People don't want to die anymore somewhere in eastern Ukraine. And remember that most of the Ukrainians that he's going to try and drag in to fight now are from the far west. And frankly, that part of the country isn't even considered their territory. This is the problem with Ukraine. It is not a cohesive nation in any sense of the word. People all over Ukraine do not think the same way, feel the same way, or want the same things. It's tragic, but he's obviously unbothered by by the human cost of his bad decisions and extraordinarily bad leadership. And of course, we have to bear some of that responsibility, since we know that General Cavoli and many of his peers have had a hand in directing the Ukrainian army on the ground. This is back to the idea of we can't mediate because we're a co-belligerent.
And it's not just Zelensky that's detached from reality. In fact, this one here by the senior diplomat for the European Union, Kaja Kallas, this is coming after, I mean, obviously, Trump's been in office for 4 months. Things have been going in this direction after the explosion in the Oval Office in February and the phone calls that have happened. Trump coming out and saying what we showed him saying just yesterday. After that, Kaja Kallas comes out before the mics today and gives this interpretation of where things are.
We heard from I think it was last week, when America said that, if Russia doesn't agree on, full and unconditional ceasefire, then there are going to be, consequences. So we want to see those consequences also from the U.S. side.
I don't know who this America is that she heard from last week, but President Trump has definitely not said there will be consequences if they don't do what we say on these sanctions issues. He's implied that he might consider it at some point, but didn't come close to saying there will be consequences. That's what the Europeans said. But you see, she's just projecting not only onto the Ukraine side, she's projecting onto the American side of what they want, and they want Trump to come along with that. But I think she's going to be pretty disappointed.
Well, replace her with Netanyahu, and you have the same outcome. This is another small state on the periphery of Eurasia that wants to harness the United States armed forces to their desired ends. In other words, please come here to the Baltic littoral, which is effectively indefensible from a military standpoint, and fight a war against Russia for us. I mean, that's what she's saying. And, someone needs to sober this woman up. Back in 1879, there was a crisis in German-Russian relations because the media in both countries were making outrageous statements along the lines of Russia must be forced to give up what today we call Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltic littoral. At that time, you had an extensive German population there, and the place was ruled largely by a German aristocracy. There was all sorts of pressure in Germany. We have to rescue our friends and cousins in the Baltic littoral. Well, Bismarck, of course, thought they were out of their minds. Finally, he had to enlist the chief of the German General Staff, von Moltke, who said, we're not coming. We're not going to do it. We don't want any more land, and there's no gold to be had. And finally, what they both said was, whatever you don't like is modest. You're not being treated badly by the Russians. And incidentally, under the Tsars, the Baltic littoral was actually treated better in many cases than their own people were. You have a different situation now. The people that live in those Baltic states are free and independent. They ought to be sober-minded. They ought to realize that they have on one side Russia, this giant millstone, and then behind them they have Europe. And you have to get along with both. You have to find a way to navigate those waters. Why aggravate the large power next to you and push it into war? It's insane. It makes no sense, especially since the Russians have evinced no interest, none. I mean, how many times have people like John Mearsheimer, who's a professor and he makes it his business to study these things on a routine basis, announced to everyone that Russia has absolutely no interest, has never stated any interest, or prepared to invade Western Europe? This is all crazy. So the Finns, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, they all need to sober up and live in the real world and stop expecting the United States or anyone else to come in and fight a war against Russia for them. It's not going to happen. This is, of course, the whole folly of NATO expansion.
Indeed it is. And in fact, speaking of NATO, there's one more European I want to look at here, because I think he is someone who, when he's talking to one group of people, he says one thing, and when he's talking to another that he knows that the president of the United States is listening to, he has a different tone. Check this out.
Let me first of all say that I'm really glad that President Trump takes this leadership role. He basically broke the deadlock from day one when he entered into office in January. And I really want to commend him for that. And I do not want to give a running commentary on every development every day. But clearly the American administration is very much involved, closely coordinating with European colleagues and of course Ukraine. And I think that is very positive.
Yeah, so it's very positive. Trump's already talking, which is not at all what he means when it says what he's talking to other audiences, where he's talking about the sanctions, that we'll never have relations with Russia afterwards, etc. But he's trying to, I think, that a lot of people try to do, he's trying to compliment Trump and say all these nice things about him so that Trump doesn't say anything negative, bad. But the bottom line is it doesn't advance what they actually want, and it doesn't come over to our side. So like a politician, he said nothing.
Well, that's probably a good move on his part, because I've never heard anything come out of the man's mouth that was coherent or thoughtful. Certainly no wisdom. He's another puppet of Washington, D.C., the CIA, and he's going to say whatever they tell him to say in most cases. This has all got to end. And that's what President Trump privately understands. And that's why if you follow the headlines, you read them carefully, he's talking about withdrawing forces from Europe. So now stop and consider this. We have, 100,000 troops along the borders with Ukraine. And we have spent billions of dollars building up Ukraine as an enemy of Russia. And he, unfortunately, instead of making a final break with the past, has simply extended the Biden administration's policies into the future. Remember what Walt said after he met with Sullivan. He said, well, I've met with Jake Sullivan, the current national security advisor. There's no daylight between us. And everyone was aghast. Everyone who voted for Trump said, then why did we vote for President Trump? Well, President Trump was elected. He takes office, and guess what? He does exactly what Walt said and extends this absolutely disastrous policy indefinitely into the future. Now, in the midst of all of this, while this continues to go on, we continue to ship arms and equipment to Ukraine. He is telling people we've got to get out of Europe and we're going to withdraw our forces from Europe. Okay, make sense out of this. How do you do one thing and then do another, or say one thing and do another? We do it all the time. So if you're sitting in Moscow, you're scratching your head and you're asking, well, which Trump is the real Trump? And what do the Americans really want? There's no consistency. You cannot govern a great nation like the United States. You cannot conduct a foreign policy without some measure of certainty. You know, this notion, well, that's strategic ambiguity. Keep them guessing. Well, my friend, you keep them guessing. They're going to guess. You may wake up and discover it's the wrong guess. And then suddenly you are at war, and whatever is left of your country is a smoldering ruin. This is not what we need. We need consistency. We had consistent stupidity under Biden. We've now extended that, but we are not consistent because President Trump is, as we've said, all over the map.
Well, and in fact, I actually want to. That's a perfect lead into what I was going to say next, because there is a report out in Axios that discusses what these conversations were between the European leaders and Trump afterwards. And you'll see what's being reported here is there is a lot of ambiguity and contradictions, and nobody knows. There's no clarity, even among the so-called allies. It says that, let's see, it says, since Trump told Putin they had agreed to talk, stressed that the U.S. would not participate in those talks, and rejected the idea of proposing sanctions on Putin. Some leaders in Europe involved in the conversation appeared surprised and shocked, the sources said. Trump and Zelensky had a brief conversation Monday morning in which Trump asked Zelensky what he should tell Putin, the source said. He told Trump that he should demand an immediate ceasefire, threaten new sanctions against Russia, and not offer any concessions to Putin. But when the conversation happened, the Russian president ended. Trump called Zelensky again, and this time the leaders of Germany, France, Italy, Finland, and the European Commission were on the line. Trump told the leaders that Putin had agreed to immediately begin direct ceasefire talks. For a few seconds, there was puzzled silence on the line. Then Zelensky noted that Putin had already agreed to talk, and in fact, they've had the first round of direct negotiations in Istanbul. After this, Trump asked about the possibility of introducing U.S. sanctions against Russia, but Trump replied that he did not think this was a good idea and stressed, in his opinion, Putin wanted to conclude an agreement. After this, Trump added that Putin would represent a peace note with his conditions for a ceasefire to end the war. Let's see, where's the other one I wanted to? Zelensky said preliminary talks rounds with Putin included last week yielded nothing and stressed that unless Trump presses, Putin will not budge. The leaders involved in the call were surprised that Trump seemed relatively pleased with what he heard from Putin and presented it as a new development, although the Russian leader did not appear to have changed his position at all. So you have the Europeans that are saying, hang on, what is going on? Because you didn't agree to any of the stuff that we did. You seem happy about it, and Putin didn't change anything and has his way. And so there's all this confusion going on even before. And again, I have to wonder, what do you think that Trump's actual intent is here? Because it sounds like that he is ready to walk, but kinda and then kinda not. So it's really hard to define. I wonder if you have any clarity on that.
Gosh, I suspect that President Trump would like to make everyone happy. Let's put it that way. He said something to everyone that everyone likes or wants to hear. But of course, you have legitimate questions as to the veracity of the statements. I think President Trump probably meant what he said to everyone. The problem is it leads to where we are now, nowhere. The point is, and this is the single most important point to keep in mind, and I'm sure that someone somewhere has tried to explain this to the president. We have no leverage. Whatever we've done has been a terrible mistake. We've destroyed relations with Russia. We should normalize relations with Russia. But to do that, we've got to end our, connection to this Ukrainian regime, stop funding and supporting the war. That has to happen. We have to admit that ultimately what happens in eastern Ukraine is a matter for Russian decision, not ours. It's never been an area of vital strategic interest to us, and it's not likely to become an area of vital strategic interest anytime soon. In fact, during World War II, as we got into the war and we were fighting and we approached the sort of end of middle to end of 1944, the truth was that we wanted to ensure that we overran Germany, not the Russians, not the Soviets at that point. Germany is what counted. Who controlled Poland was largely irrelevant to us. There was nothing in Poland except nice Polish people. But Germany was different. We ended up with a little more than half of what was there. And that was an unsatisfactory outcome, and that led to the Cold War. Well, the problem for us is that we were too slow to pick up. Our forces moved too slowly. We lost the opportunity for a clear-cut victory. Well, this time around, the people with the real interest are the Russians, not us. We just don't have any interest in that part of the world. And I think President Trump knows that. He will probably say what any American would say, I hope these people can just get along. Well, that may or may not happen, but the point is it's not our affair. He just needs to get out. And that much, I think, Vice President Vance gets right. But otherwise, if we continue to stick our nose into this, we'll make it worse. We need to get out of it.
And I argue that we need to get out quickly, that this alleged we're days away from walking, et cetera, that Rubio has said a couple of times, Trump said on May the 4th on NBC News. And he implied it again in the aftermath of this call. I argue it needs to happen quickly. And the reason why is because events continue to develop on the battlefield that could force the issue and not leave Trump any leverage to do anything at all. I want to get into a little bit about, we talked about the Russian deal that has been on the table, which is the June 14th deal, conditions from last summer, which is all for the administrative borders of those four oblasts. Lavrov said today, though, something that implies that they actually have more in mind. Sergei Lavrov said today that Russia will not leave the Orthodox people of Ukraine in trouble and will ensure that their legitimate rights are respected and canonical Orthodoxy retains its central place in the spiritual life of the people in Ukraine lands. The guarantee that these goals will be achieved is the position of the Russian Federation. This was once again clearly affirmed by President Putin. So he's implying that not just those 4 oblasts, but he wants to control things up to, which, of course, if you're looking at the map, would be at least up to the Dnieper River, because there are large numbers of ethnic Russians between those 4 oblasts and the river, etc. Then we have the actual conduct of the battlefield itself, and that is starting to pick up speed, despite the belief that many say it doesn't. Here is Julian Rupka on a video that he made just yesterday, talking about what's happening in the central area of the Pokrovsk, of the front line on the Eastern Front.
Ukraine immer schwieriger, denn wir sehen es ja hier mal im Weiteren. Man hat ja seit Monaten versucht, Pokrovsk hier südlich zu flankieren. Man hat versucht, hier weiterzukommen, eben auch die E50, die Autobahn nach Dnipropetrovsk abzuschneiden. Das hat nicht funktioniert. Das heißt, die neue Idee, die Russen haben, und die funktioniert leider sehr erfolgreich, ist eben die Flankierung, also die Einkesselung von Pokrovsk über die nördliche Flanke. Und hier hat man, wir haben es schon in den letzten Tagen gezeigt, tatsächlich innerhalb der letzten ungefähr.
So what for people who may not have been able to read that, and I know Doug speaks fluent
I speak German, so I could understand what he said. I thought it was interesting. He said, unfortunately, the Russians have been successful. And he's talking about something the Russians have been practicing now for some time on the tactical and operational levels. That are these, what they used to call Kesselschlachten. He says, eingekesselt. That means essentially encircled and then destroyed. They simply call the area where you capture the enemy forces from the flanks as a pot, So they put a lot of Ukrainians into the pot. Well, he's right. And this is going to open avenues to the west towards the Dnieper River. And again, and I've said this in a number of forums, and people that know nothing about the history of the region fail to grasp this point. For most of its history, especially after 1260, roughly, and the destruction of the Kievan Rus, Kiev subsequently became a Polish-Lithuanian outpost. In other words, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, initially the Duchy of Lithuania, then subsequently the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, controlled everything west of the Dnieper River. And in the West, in Western capitals, whether you sat in Vienna or Berlin or Paris or anywhere else, generally regarded the Dnieper River out there as the westernmost boundary of Western civilization. In other words, beyond that river, there were these people who were Russians. We didn't really know much about them at that point. They were fundamentally different because they were an Orthodox Christian, almost Byzantine state. And then beside them, you still had the Mongol Khanates and the Tartar Khanates. So the river itself has for a very long time meant that border. By the way, in the original Barbarossa plan, when they went in 1941, the original man who wrote the order, which Hitler disliked, insisted that the entire German Wehrmacht halt for a minimum of 6 months along the Dnieper River so that they could come in and build airfields and railroad extensions and rail hubs and everything else. He said, if you don't do that, logistics will destroy you before you ever get to Moscow, which of course is largely what happened. My point is the Dnieper River is a natural barrier. And I've said over and over and over again, I'm sure the Russian general staff, these are competent men. I'm sure they've said to the president, Mr. President, let's march to the river. Whatever we do, let us control everything east of the river. That gives us a buffer zone against any future threats that may emanate from what remains of Ukraine. And let the rest of it go. After all, the Poles, Romanians, the Hungarians, probably the Lithuanians, the Moldovans, everybody is making claims on portions of Western Ukraine. The Romanians would like to have Bessarabia back. Most of the people listening to us today don't even know what that is. My point is, this is a very old part of the world. We need to get out of it. It's not us. We know nothing about it. But everybody who lives in it and around it does know about it. They need to sort this out. And I can guarantee you that there's very little enthusiasm for crossing that Dnieper River and moving further west. They don't want to do it. It's more trouble than it's worth. You end up with lots of people under your administrative control that hate you and always have because of that boundary that I just discussed, which has been valid for hundreds of years. So the bottom line is, let's stop the nonsense. President Trump, suspend all further aid to this Ukrainian disaster. get out, offer to host a conference. We can host it in Europe. We can host it anywhere they would like. Let them all come without us, by the way. We can have a representative that sits in and listens, but let the people that live in it and around it make the decision on where the new boundaries will be drawn, and let it go. It's not us. It's not our country.
Now, it could be that Trump is moving in that direction, because he did say that that the two sides are going to be the ones who are going to figure this part out. We're not going to. So apparently he is out of the mediating business. We'll see if that continues to be the case. But what could be, and I stress could be, motivating him and hopefully to make the very decision you just articulated, is because he's taken a look and things are literally starting to crumble on the battlefield. We've been talking about the possibility of this for a long time, but there are more signs that something is afoot here. First of all, a week or so ago, the New York Times reported from the Institute for the Study of War, which sometimes has good numbers, even if their analysis is just hideous. But they said over the previous 16 months, the Russians had taken 1,800 square kilometers from Ukraine. They don't even talk about in there how many troops that the Ukraine side had lost. But then they point out that in wars of attrition, incremental gains can presage a breakthrough if the losing side runs out of troops, ammunition, and its defensive lines collapse. Now then we have, in the last just few days here, the commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade was resigned, and this is their premier mechanized brigade, the 47th, because he said, these stupid decisions that these guys keep making that get us killed and don't even have a chance of success. He finally resigned in disgust. Then, right after that, the commander of the 59th Brigade was fired because, and when you read down into the details, it's not just that he didn't do a good job. It's that in the Pokrovsk area that Julian Ripker was showing just a second ago, he had a tactical redeployment of his troops from an unfavorable position to a favorable position, but it was a little bit further back. And so almost like a Hitler type deal, the Ukraine leadership with Sersky and then, of course, Zelensky says not 1 inch. No, you can't redeploy anywhere, even if it makes sense. And this guy was beside himself because he said, we weren't leaving. We're just getting to a more advantageous position further back. And you see it's falling apart. Several of the Ukrainian telegram channels are warning of a growing possibility of a revolt of the forces at large. And this could be some of the first cracks in that. So we could be seeing, Doug, something you and I have speculated about for a long time, that this thing could actually collapse, and then nobody in Ukraine or Russia or Europe is going to have any choices in the matter.
Well, one could make an argument that you want to, if you're Zelensky, you want to keep the Ukrainian troops in the field as long as possible, because the moment you tell them there's a ceasefire or there's any indication whatsoever of a willingness to come to a solution with Moscow, the forces will fall back. And once they fall back, they're going to turn their attention to Mr. Zelensky. And you and I have talked about this, as you say, before. There's been a lot of discontent. A lot of good men have died pointlessly. There was never any strategy. The tactics were always bad. We were not prepared to fight this kind of war in the West. And unfortunately, the generals in charge seem to have been largely American and British. And they seem to have prevailed upon the Ukrainians to do a number of stupid things. At the same time, you have, as you point out, this Hitlerian predisposition to hold every inch of ground. But if you go back and look at the Russians from the very beginning, they treated ground as something that was only important insofar as it conferred an advantage on them. And that's something the Russians understand because it's their country. And they've been dealing with enemies, Mongolian enemies, Tartar enemies, French enemies, Western enemies, any number of different enemies over the centuries. They always knew. In fact, very recently, I was consulting a wonderful book, which every American who is interested at all in military affairs, and especially Russia, should read. And it's essentially the diary of Major General Kulankour, who is the aide-de-camp to Napoleon. And Kulankour went to visit Tsar Alexander I in Vilnius before Napoleon invaded the country. Napoleon was assembling his army. And Kulankour told him, well, the emperor is going to invade your country unless you agree to our terms on the continental system and end your relations with Britain and close your markets and so forth. and he wants to invade. And the Tsar Alexander I said, well, he can certainly do that, but we will do what we've always done. We will fall back into the interior. I have a very large country. We'll fall back, and eventually you'll catch up to us, and we'll be waiting for you. And that's exactly what happened. We don't get it. We utterly do not get it. You served in the U.S. Army with me. You know the mentality. Everybody and their brother's about holding ground. When did we in a mobile force ever give a damn about holding ground? It was irrelevant. It's not important at all. That's what the Russians understand. We do not. And that's why they are outmaneuvering, encircling, and destroying Ukrainian forces successfully in one stage after the next. Once again, we're in over our heads. We're not organized to fight this way. We've screwed it up for the Ukrainians badly. We need to get out.
Yeah, that's certainly what we need to do. And we'll see what we end up doing. Trump has given some indications. Maybe he's going that direction. Events on the battlefield may be pushing in that direction or so. Whether he'll do it in time certainly remains to be seen, something we're going to continue to watch. In the last few minutes that we have here, I want to switch gears to something else just to kind of to get your reaction, and something that is pretty abhorrent. I'll just give people a warning at the beginning. This is a video that was put out on Israeli television this morning. It's Channel 14 by a former member of the Knesset of Israel. Here's what he had to say about the situation in Gaza.
כל ילד, כל תינוק בעזה הוא אויב. האויב הוא לא החמאס, והוא גם לא הזרוע הצבאית של החמאס, כמו שהפצ"רית שלנו מספרת לנו שאסור לנו לפגוע בחמאסניק, אלא אם כן הוא חלק מהזרוע הצבאית. כל ילד בעזה הוא האויב. אנחנו צריכים לכבוש את עזה וליישבה, ושלא יישאר שם ילד עזתי אחד. אין ניצחון אחר.
Now, for those who don't know, and probably most of our Western audience doesn't, this is the same person that on the 23rd of October, so barely 2 weeks after the terrorist event that started all this current round, rather, he went on this Israeli television and said that they needed to turn the Gaza Strip into Dresden, that they needed to kill everyone. And that's pretty much what has happened. So this is not just some fringe person here. And the fact that he continues to be brought on Israeli television tells you something. What are your reactions to that?
I'm completely unsurprised. No one should be surprised by this. And if you push the Israeli Jews to talk to you openly about this, they will make it clear that they have every right to do this. The Torah justifies it. The Talmud justifies it. Frankly, anyone who is not a Jew can be treated in the same way if they determine that it's necessary to do so. We don't seem to understand the radicalized population and leadership in Israel. We don't seem to understand it. We don't grasp it. And admittedly, it is hard for us to grasp. I can't comprehend it. To me, it's beyond simple good and evil. It's something worse. But that's where we are. And have no fear. The lobby controls things here in the United States on the Hill, as well as in the media and to some extent in finance. And I think they're going to make sure that most Americans do not hear that, do not see that, and are told that that is a fringe view. It is not a fringe view. That's the problem. If it were a fringe view, Mr. Netanyahu would not be in power.
Well, in fact, speaking of that, that's one of the things that worries. I don't think we have this clip handy now, but we had yesterday that there was a comment by Steve Witkoff from the weekend where he was talking specifically about Gaza, and he said that there's no daylight between Trump and Netanyahu. And if there was ever a place for a hell of a lot of daylight, it's right here. Because what that guy said there is only fringe if it's not. I mean, it can't be considered fringe when you see with your own eyes that it's being employed every day. And that is not something that the United States wants to be associated with. Although, I mean, we shouldn't want to be. But obviously, we had all of the years of the Biden administration, and now Trump hasn't distanced himself from it. He needs to put some daylight in because, Doug, I just don't think that time is going to be good on anybody who's associated with this. I think the clock is going to, or the pendulum is going to swing in a direction we won't like later.
Everyone is concerned about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. That said, it is a very complicated situation there. Logistically, I don't think there's any daylight between President Trump's position and Prime Minister Netanyahu's position. The issue now is, how do we logistically get all of those trucks into Gaza? How do we set up the aid stations? There are many initiatives that we're working on to address this.
Oh, Gary, you're amazing. But you see there, I mean, Witkoff is talking about how Trump is like trying to get this stuff done. It's a simple directive. Get the damn trucks in there today. They're already posted up there. So to claim that you're trying means you're not trying.
Well, there's a gentleman named Jason Jones who served in the U.S. Army, had a couple of tours in Iraq, and then he left, and he has become deeply involved in trying to relieve suffering in Gaza. Many of his friends, some are Arabs, some are not, have been killed by the IDF trying to deliver aid. I would recommend that you find Jason and Jason Jones, look him up, he's got a website, and bring him on the program and let him talk about this. I interviewed him, but I don't think the interview was ever published. I'm not sure why that hasn't happened, but perhaps it will now. The point is this, there's nothing complex about it. You have an organization called UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the UN Relief Agency. I saw them in action in Bosnia-Herzegovina. They did a brilliant job there. They were first class. And then subsequently in Kosovo. They can do all of these things, but they're not going to go into an area where if you go in, you stand a very high probability of being killed by the IDF. And that's the problem. So Mr. Witkoff is doing what he thinks is his job to protect President Trump. And I understand that, but this is pretty cut and dried. And I find it incomprehensible that any American that sees this and sees, worst of all, our hand in it, our influence in it, our support for it, our financing for it, would not be deeply, deeply disturbed. But once again, Dan, I don't know how widespread the understanding is inside our country. I run into people all the time say, oh, well, that's not really our affair. And I said, well, neither is Ukraine. Well, yeah. Well, Israel, we're allied with them. No, we have no treaty of alliance with Israel, never have. And they say, well, yeah, but they're our friend. Well, I used to think so. I'm not sure any longer.
Yeah, I think that about sums it up. I'm just not sure any longer. Maybe they never were. Maybe I was mistaken. I don't know. But with this kind of thing going on a daily basis, and now then you have, even after Witkoff's intervention here, you have Netanyahu. I think we had that one on yesterday where he's basically saying we'll do the absolute least we can to get by so that we don't lose America's support here. But meaning they're just going to give some crumbs. But to not allow any kind of large scale food in. I think the number is they need somewhere around 150 trucks, I think, per day to meet the minimum needs for the 2 million people that still live in there. Yesterday, they finally let 8 trucks in, and they want to say that's something, which of course it's literal crumbs, and it won't do anything. But I just don't understand how much oil. There it is right there. Again, Gary's on top of it. Netanyahu says minimal aid will go into Gaza to preserve U.S. support. He's even open saying it, headlines in the Washington Post, and there's no uproar. Nobody seems to be concerned about that. And I just think, Doug, that in time, this is all going to come back to haunt us, and that we will regret not taking action right now while we have the chance.
Well, as I recollect, someone some time ago made the statement, cast your bread upon the waters, and in a few days it will return manyfold unto you.
I remember that, or I've read that. But we don't seem to be wanting to apply it, and we certainly don't want it to apply it in a negative sense, but that's beyond our control. And where we have control, we're not exerting it. And so we'll just have to wait and see how it goes, and just have to hope and pray that one of these days Trump wakes up and says this is just immoral and unethical and not good for our country. But for right now, that's just what we have. And we just thank you for coming on, providing such clarity to this stuff, both on the Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East stuff. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you guys for watching us today, too. By the way, there's going to be a meeting at 3 o'clock today between President, or not a meeting, but a presentation of some sort. They're being kind of coy about what that is, between the Secretary of Defense Hegseth and Trump at 3 o'clock. We're going to have the results of that for you at 4 o'clock today. So be sure and join us at 4 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we'll give you the skinny on what has happened and what the ramifications are for our country. Thank you very much, and we'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.